Apples were incredibly important to the population of 18th century America and Great Britain. Today, we don't think about apples. We can get them at the grocery store anytime we want. We have a half a dozen, maybe a dozen kind of varieties that we could get. But in the 18th century, it was a matter of survival, especially for the poorer segments of society. Apples were a mainstay, especially for the poorer populations when they wanted fruit. And the main reason for that is because apples can last a long time. After harvest time, they'll last into the winter, into the spring, and sometimes into the early part of the summer of next year. Some of the apple varieties were really good at that. Other apple varieties really were meant to be eaten right away. I mentioned the idea that in a common grocery store in North America today, you might find upwards to a dozen varieties of apples. In the 18th century, there were many, many more varieties. That's what's kind of incredible. There were probably 100 varieties, if not more, of apple or very similar apple kind of fruits that were available to just about anybody. They all had their speciality. Some apples, like I said, were good for storage. Other ones were specifically grown for something like cider, and cider was incredibly popular in the 18th century. Other apples were specifically for eating, table apples, a great taste raw. But many of the apples were special varieties for cooking in different kinds of settings. Apples that we might need for pies or other types, say applesauce. All these amazing apple varieties, some of them harvesting very early on in the apple season, coming in the middle of summer or late summer, and then others almost a winter apple. One of the reasons why we don't see the kind of variety in apples that they had in the 18th century is today our apples are specifically grown for transportation. Since our food is shipped all over the world and all over the country, certainly we want apples that can easily be transported from one place to another without being damaged. But that was not important in the 18th century. Most apples were eaten fairly close to where they were grown, so transportation is not high on the list of characteristics. They wanted things like flavor or a particular culinary use, so they could really kind of hone in on particular apples. Some apples grow really well in a very particularly small region, and so you would have a special apple for a particular area. Apples were so important to the economy of farms, whether it's a large farm or a small farm, that they almost always had some kind of an orchard. If you had any kind of a complete farm at all, yes, you had field crops, you would probably have livestock, but you would have orchards. And they even had different kinds of orchards. You would have a sort of a wild orchard where you had particular kinds of apple trees, your livestock might graze within it, and then more of an ornamental or a small fruit orchard that's closer to the house, specifically for table fruits that you're going to be eating all the time. And if you don't have an orchard, well, you don't have a complete farm. If we look at The Bark-Covered House, which is the memoir of William Nolan, that he talks about growing up in Pioneer, Michigan in the 1830s. And one of the special parts in the book is where he talks about going and buying some of the very first apple trees that were in his area. So his father and he went, after they had cleared enough ground that they could start an orchard, they went and bought apple trees and carried them and planted them. And even now, as he writes in his memoir 50 or 60 years later, that those apple trees are still bearing. Let's look at some of the fun and fascinating names of the apples they had available in the 18th century. So here are some of the dessert, summer, and culinary apples. We've got the Margate apple, the Codlin apple, the summer Calville apple, the Pippins, a lot of different kinds of pippins, golden pippins, Holland pippins, Kentish pippins, aromatic pippins. Again, some of these are directly related to the area that they grow in. There's a type of apple called a pearmain apple. So they had royal pearmain, ruffet pearmain, scarlet pearmain, and I mentioned ruffet pearmains. There were ruffet apples, and the ruffet apples had a rough exterior to them. The golden ruffet, the royal ruffet, the leather coat ruffet, and the green ruffeting. Some of them were just really strange apples. So there's one called the cat's head apple. That was a very, very large apple for the time period. There's the custard apple, the Harvey apple, the queen apple. There's one apple that's listed here called the violet apple that had a hint of a violet flavor to them. So they had all sorts of different colors, all sorts of different shapes, some of them small, some of them large. They had a kind of a related apple called a medlar, which isn't exactly an apple. But one of the fascinating things about medlars is that the wood is especially good for using as the teeth of the wooden gears on a windmill. So not only were the apples interesting themselves, but the wood of the apple trees were also good for specialty things, sometimes used for tool handles or for musical instruments. Now, many of these are specialty apples that would show up on the tables of the rich. But what about apples for poor people? One of the places we can find and get some really specific information on this is from William Ellis's Country Housewife's Family Companion that was printed in 1750. He writes a book basically about how to run a small farm and the sorts of things you want to do in a small farm. They're using servants or workers that are traveling into the area, especially at harvest time. And one of the jobs of the farmer in that particular situation is to feed those workers. So they're staying on a farm for a couple of weeks or maybe even a month. And it's his job to feed them enough, but he has to do it economically. And so William Ellis talks about particular recipes. And apples come up multiple times. Apple pies, apple puddings, and he uses those because they will sweeten the dish, but they don't take any sugar to do it. And so it's a way to make very inexpensive dishes without using the expensive sugar of the 18th century. I mentioned specific kinds of varieties for cider, and cider apples had to have the right kind of flavor. They had to have an extra amount of juiciness to them and the ability to separate that juice from the pulp of the apple. Another nice thing about a cider apple is you make all that apple cider at one point in the year, right after harvest. And so a cider apple does not have to be one of those apple varieties that's good overwintering or lasting into the spring. Besides cider, you also have apple brandy, and apples are so good for making something like cider that turns alcoholic, and then we can use that alcohol that comes from the apple cider to make something like apple brandy that was very, very popular in America in the early 19th century. Apples show up in so many recipes: apple pies, apple tarts, apple puddings, apple dumplings. We have something that's like an apple sauce. They also used apples inside of other recipes like pancakes. They had apple pancakes, they had chunks of apples in them. An apple fraise, where you take sort of a slice of apple and put pancake on both sides, and apple fritters. Think apple pancakes, but deep fried. Apples are so incredibly versatile that I wanted to do a recipe that really kind of showed that off. So I picked out one of the simplest, easy to do recipes. This shows up in many different cookbooks in the 18th century. I decided to go with the London Art of Cookery. This is 1784. The recipe is called Black Caps. It says, take out the cores and cut into halves 12 large apples. Place them on a thin patty pan as close as they can lie, with the flat side downwards. Squeeze a lemon into 2 spoonfuls of lemon flower water. Pour it over them. Shred some lemon peel fine and throw it over them. Grate a little sugar or grate fine sugar over all. Set them in a quick oven for a half an hour. We'll do them. Throw some fine sugar over all the dish and set them to the table. Here is what we're going to do. This is ultra simple. We're going to simplify it just a touch here. We don't need orange flower water. I think that just adds a little too much, and it's kind of difficult to get these days. Yes, you can find it on Amazon, but we're just going to take some of these apples. Now, many recipes call for pippins, and we want a baking apple. I've chosen here Granny Smith's. because they're easy to get for just about anybody, and they're good for this kind of dish. These Granny Smith apples, we will cut them in half so that we can core them very easily. We're gonna lay them in this dish. We need a dish that has sides to it so that the liquids don't just run off. Then we're going to just squeeze lemon over the top and sprinkle a little sugar over the top. That's it. They go into the oven like that for about half an hour at 350 degrees or so, and this will bake them right in that dish with that little bit of lemon juice, and they should turn out fine. They're called black caps for a reason. The little top surface should get dark. You might have to broil them a touch to get that dark spot on the top of them, but that just caramelizes those flavors, and it should be just amazing. They look great. Of course, they smelled great. You don't want to let them get so far that they burn, although burning them is kind of the point, right? The whole idea of getting the black cap on them is to kind of burn that surface. I'm not sure whether they intended to eat the skin or whether it was just to sort of cover it up. I don't know. I'm going to try a piece here that's both the inside and the outside. So I think they're meant to go together. Without a little bit of the skin, you just have sort of an applesauce thing going on here. That's good by itself, but the skin gives us a lot more to it. I think the whole point is we get that sugary flavor from the caramelizing on the outside of the apple. So the fact that these went to sort of a dark brown, probably just right. Black, probably a little bit too far. But great flavor, very interesting dish, and so utterly simple to do. Apples are so amazingly versatile, whether it was 250 years ago or today, very simple to cook with, or hey, we can just eat them right out of the bag. A great food item, and it's directly connected with America and Great Britain of 250 years ago.